Maybe if someone here actually contributed money instead of bringing cheap casseroles every year, we wouldn't be drowning in debt, my daughter-in-law Vanessa said at the Thanksgiving table while everyone laughed nervously and stared down at their plates. My son Daniel didn't defend me. He just rubbed his forehead and kept eating as if humiliation had become another side dish beside the mashed potatoes and turkey gravy. I smiled softly and passed the cranberry sauce to my granddaughter Mia, pretending the words hadn't settled into my chest like cold rain. I'm Evelyn Harper. I'm 71 years old, and for the last 6 years, my family has believed I was poor. The dining room smelled of roasted rosemary turkey, buttered rolls, and the cinnamon candles Vanessa always lit when guests came over. Everything looked beautiful in the warm amber light hanging above the table, but underneath it all, the house carried a tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. Daniel's mortgage payments were 3 months behind. His construction company was barely surviving. And despite all the designer handbags Vanessa kept buying and the luxury SUV parked outside, everyone at that table knew the truth. They were sinking. Vanessa adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and forced a brittle laugh. I'm serious, she continued. Some people contribute emotionally. Other people contribute financially. Her eyes flicked toward me for half a second before she sipped her wine. Mia stopped eating. I noticed because children always notice cruelty faster than adults do. Grandma's sweet potato casserole is my favorite, she whispered quietly. Vanessa gave her daughter a tight smile. Honey, adults are talking. I lowered my eyes to my plate and carefully folded my napkin in my lap. I had spent 43 years learning that silence often revealed more than anger ever could. Outside the dining room window, cold November rain tapped softly against the glass. The weather forecast had warned about storms all weekend, but the real storm had already arrived long before dinner started. Daniel finally cleared his throat. Can we please not do this tonight? His voice sounded exhausted. Not angry. Just tired in the way people become when life begins collecting debts faster than they can pay them. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. I'm trying to be realistic. We can't keep pretending everything is fine. The irony nearly made me smile again, because I knew exactly how bad things were, better than any of them did. Earlier that morning, while they were decorating the table and arguing over wine glasses, I had received a phone call from Walter Green, the attorney who had handled my late husband's business affairs for decades. His voice had been calm, but urgent. Evelyn, he said carefully, the bank issued a final foreclosure notice this morning. Daniel has 14 days left before they take the house. After dinner, I stayed behind to wash the dishes even though Vanessa had barely spoken to me for the rest of the evening. The house slowly emptied into silence. Mia went upstairs with her homework. Daniel disappeared into his office with another stack of unpaid invoices under his arm. Vanessa sat in the living room scrolling through furniture websites on her tablet, as though shopping could somehow erase fear. I stood at the sink with warm water running over my hands and watched my reflection in the dark kitchen window. Age had changed my face in quiet ways. Softer skin, silver hair, lines around my mouth that deepened every time I swallowed words instead of speaking them. Vanessa believed those things made me weak, poor, dependent. She had never understood the difference between looking modest and having nothing. The next morning, I woke before sunrise in my small guest room at the end of the hallway. The room used to belong to Daniel when he was a teenager. They had moved me there after Vanessa converted my old bedroom into what she called a wellness office. Most of my belongings fit into 2 storage bins and 1 cedar chest at the foot of the bed. I did not complain. At my age, peace mattered more than square footage. I slipped on my old wool cardigan and walked quietly into the kitchen. The house was cold. November wind rattled softly against the windows while the coffee maker hissed in the darkness. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the leftovers from Thanksgiving dinner stacked in plastic containers. The sweet potato casserole sat untouched. Mia had been the only person who asked for seconds. I smiled faintly at the thought. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Vanessa entered wearing silk pajamas and immediately opened her expensive espresso machine beside the counter. She barely looked at me. Daniel did not sleep at all, she said coldly. The bank keeps calling. I nodded once and wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. She leaned against the marble island and sighed dramatically. I honestly do not know how people survive without financial planning. The words hung in the air deliberately, like bait. I noticed her eyes drift toward my worn cardigan, then toward the coupon booklet sitting beside my purse. You know, she continued, sometimes pride keeps people stuck in poverty. I looked down at the steam rising from my coffee before answering quietly. And sometimes appearances keep people blind. She frowned slightly at that, just enough for me to notice. Then she gave a small shrug and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Around 10 that morning, I left the house in my old blue sedan and drove downtown through steady rain. The windshield wipers squeaked every few seconds, and the heater only worked when the engine felt like cooperating. Vanessa hated that car. She once asked me why I did not buy something newer because, according to her, the car made the family look bad. What she never realized was that I could have replaced that car 10 times over without noticing the money gone. I parked outside a brick office building near Main Street and walked carefully through the drizzle, holding my umbrella against the wind. Walter Green was already waiting when I entered his office. He stood slowly and gave me the same sad look he had worn ever since my husband Arthur passed away 8 years earlier. You still have time to walk away from this, Evelyn, he said gently. I removed my gloves one finger at a time and sat across from his desk. No, I answered softly. I walked away from anger a long time ago, but I will not walk away from my son. Walter opened a thick folder and slid several documents across the desk toward me. The papers smelled faintly of ink and old cardboard, the way legal offices always seem to smell no matter how modern the furniture became. Outside his office window, downtown Ashford looked gray beneath the rain. People hurried along the sidewalks with umbrellas tilted against the wind while car headlights reflected off the wet pavement in long silver streaks. Walter removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose slowly. Daniel never told Vanessa about the second loan, he said quietly. I lowered my eyes to the paperwork without touching it. I already knew. Walter continued carefully, as though speaking too loudly might somehow make the truth heavier. The construction business lost nearly $200,000 last year. Then he refinanced the house to keep payroll going. I closed my eyes for a moment. Daniel had always carried his father's heart. Loyal, proud, too willing to sacrifice himself silently while pretending everything was under control. How bad is it? I asked. Walter exhaled softly. If the bank proceeds Monday morning, they lose the house. The business will collapse shortly after. I nodded once and stared at the rain sliding down the glass outside. Strange how quickly people could go from hosting dinner parties to losing everything. Walter hesitated before speaking again. Vanessa still does not know the full numbers, does she? A faint smile touched my lips, though there was no joy in it. Vanessa only notices numbers when they are attached to jewelry or vacations. Walter looked uncomfortable at that. He had met her many times over the years. Enough to understand exactly what I meant without needing further explanation. He reached into the folder again and carefully removed another envelope. Older, thicker, cream-colored. Arthur left very specific instructions regarding the investment accounts, he said. Hearing my husband's name after all these years still softened something inside me. Arthur Harper had been the kind of man who noticed quiet things. Cracked porch steps, empty gas tanks, tired eyes. He used to leave me handwritten notes inside kitchen drawers because he knew I would eventually find them while cooking dinner. Even now, after 8 years without him, I could still hear his voice every time rain touched the windows. Walter slid the envelope closer to me. You protected those assets exactly the way he asked. I rested my hand gently on the envelope, but did not open it. Arthur believed Daniel would need help one day, I said quietly. Walter leaned back in his chair. And what do you believe? For several seconds, I said nothing. I thought about Thanksgiving dinner. Vanessa laughing softly at my old cardigan. Daniel staring at unpaid bills until his eyes looked hollow. Mia defending my casserole in a room full of adults too distracted to notice cruelty. Then I thought about all the years before that. The overtime shifts at the diner after Arthur died. The nights I skipped dinner so Daniel could afford baseball cleats. The tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper where I spent winters wrapping towels beneath the windows to keep cold air out. Children rarely remember the years their parents struggled for them. They only remember whether life eventually became comfortable. I believe my son forgot where he came from, I answered softly. Walter studied me carefully. And Vanessa? I finally looked up at him. Vanessa never knew. When I returned to the house that afternoon, A black delivery van sat in the driveway unloading expensive Christmas decorations even though Thanksgiving had ended less than 24 hours earlier. Giant illuminated reindeer stood beside imported wreaths still wrapped in plastic. Through the front window, I could already see Vanessa directing workers around the living room while holiday music played loudly through the speakers. For a moment, I simply sat inside my old sedan with the engine running and watched the scene through the rain-covered windshield. Then my phone vibrated quietly inside my purse. A message from Daniel appeared on the screen. "Mom, do you have a minute tonight? I need to talk to someone." That evening, the house glowed with soft white Christmas lights even though December had not yet begun. Vanessa believed expensive decorations could make people forget difficult realities. Garland wrapped around the staircase. Scented candles burned in every room. Holiday music drifted through the speakers while unopened bills sat hidden inside Daniel's office drawer upstairs. I carried a basket of folded laundry down the hallway when I noticed his office door slightly open. Light spilled across the hardwood floor beneath it. Daniel sat alone behind his desk with both hands pressed against his face. For a moment, he looked less like a 43-year-old businessman and more like the exhausted little boy who used to fall asleep at the kitchen table while doing homework beside me. I knocked softly against the doorframe. "You wanted to talk?" He looked up quickly, embarrassed to be seen struggling. "Yeah, come in, Mom." I entered quietly and closed the door behind me. His office smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Blueprints covered one side of the desk. Tax notices covered the other. Daniel pushed several papers aside and leaned back heavily in his chair. Deep shadows sat beneath his eyes. "I did not want you hearing everything from Vanessa," he said after a long silence. I sat across from him without speaking. Sometimes people tell the truth faster when they are not interrupted. He stared down at his hands. The company lost 3 contracts this year. Material costs went up. Then 2 clients delayed payment at the same time. His voice sounded hollow. I kept thinking I could fix it before anyone noticed. I nodded slightly. "And now?" Daniel laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. "Now I owe more money than I can breathe around." He turned his computer monitor slightly toward me. Numbers filled the screen in red. Past due notices. Loan balances. Interest rates climbing month after month like floodwater. "I refinanced the house twice," he admitted. "Vanessa still thinks things will turn around after Christmas." Outside the office window, wind pushed rain against the glass in uneven waves. The storm had grown heavier since afternoon. I remembered another storm many years earlier when Daniel was 11 years old and Arthur had been in the hospital for the 3rd time that winter. We had exactly $43 left in our checking account. Daniel never knew that I spent those nights pretending I was not hungry, so he could have seconds at dinner. Children should sleep peacefully. That was always my belief. Parents carried fear so their children would not have to. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. "I feel like I failed everyone." I looked at him carefully. "No," I said softly. "You made mistakes. That is different." He swallowed hard and stared toward the floor. "Vanessa keeps talking about appearances. Keeping the house. Keeping up with everything." He paused for several seconds before continuing quietly. "I do not even know if we can afford groceries next month." Something inside me tightened at those words. Not because of the money. Money comes and goes. But because shame had finally reached his voice. That was always the real breaking point for proud men. Daniel suddenly looked at me with tired eyes. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." He hesitated. "How did you survive after Dad died?" The room became very still. I folded my hands together in my lap and thought about Arthur again. About hospital bills. About overdue rent notices. About waiting tables during double shifts while wearing shoes with holes hidden beneath the soles. "One day at a time," I answered quietly. "And by learning the difference between what people need and what they only want others to see." Daniel lowered his eyes. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa laughing on the phone with one of her friends about holiday party plans. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. Then Daniel reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an unopened envelope with the bank's logo stamped across the front. His hand trembled slightly as he handed it to me. "The foreclosure hearing is Monday morning," he whispered. Saturday arrived cold and gray, with thin sheets of ice covering the edges of the driveway by early morning. Vanessa had been awake since dawn preparing for Mia's birthday party, as though nothing in the house was collapsing behind the walls. Delivery boxes filled the front hallway. Pink balloons floated near the staircase. Caterers carried trays of food into the kitchen while holiday music played softly from hidden speakers throughout the house. Anyone walking through the front door would have believed this family was thriving. That was Vanessa's talent. She could decorate over disaster until even she almost believed the illusion herself. I stayed mostly out of the way, helping quietly where I could. Around noon, I finished wrapping Mia's birthday gift at the small desk inside my room. It was not expensive, just a leather-bound sketchbook and a set of charcoal pencils because Mia loved drawing old houses and trees during quiet afternoons. Children often reveal themselves through the things they create. Mia always drew homes with warm windows glowing in the dark. I tied a silver ribbon carefully around the package just as Vanessa appeared in the doorway. Her eyes moved slowly across my room. The narrow bed, the single lamp, the folded sweaters stacked neatly beside the cedar chest. "Guests will start arriving soon," she said briskly. "I need everyone downstairs by 2. I nodded once. Then her eyes settled on the wrapped gift in my hands. "You really did not have to buy anything," she added lightly. "Mia already has everything she needs." There was something sharp beneath the sweetness of her voice. I recognized it immediately. It was not gratitude. It was dismissal. "It is only a sketchbook," I said quietly. Vanessa smiled thinly. "That makes sense." She turned toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. We are doing assigned seating for lunch." I looked up at her calmly. "All right. Since the dining table is full, we set up an extra place for you near the kitchen." She said it casually, almost cheerfully, as though she were discussing weather instead of humiliation. "It is quieter there anyway." I held her gaze for several seconds before answering softly. "Of course." After she left, I sat very still on the edge of my bed. Downstairs, I could already hear guests arriving. Laughter, coat hangers clinking inside the hallway closet, glasses touching together. I looked at the silver ribbon around Mia's gift and suddenly remembered a birthday party from nearly 30 years earlier. Daniel had turned 13 that winter. I could not afford decorations, so I spent half the night cutting stars from aluminum foil and hanging them from the kitchen ceiling with sewing thread. Daniel had hugged me afterward and whispered, "This feels like the best birthday ever." Back then, love had still been enough to impress him. By 3 o'clock, the house was overflowing with people. Vanessa moved through the rooms wearing a cream-colored designer dress, while complimenting the catering and laughing loudly at every conversation. Daniel looked pale beneath his smile. He kept checking his phone every few minutes whenever he thought nobody noticed. During lunch, I found my assigned seat exactly where Vanessa described it. A small folding chair beside the kitchen doorway, half hidden behind a decorative plant. From there, I could hear the party, but not truly belong to it. Mia noticed immediately. Her face fell the moment she saw where I was sitting. "Grandma should sit with us," she said quietly. Vanessa touched her daughter's shoulder and forced another smile. "Sweetheart, the table is full." Mia looked toward me helplessly. I simply smiled and opened my napkin across my lap. Some humiliations become easier to survive once age teaches you they reveal more about others than yourself. Then Daniel's phone rang again. This time, I watched the color drain slowly from his face as he listened. The room around Daniel continued laughing while his entire expression changed. It happened slowly at first. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes lost focus. Then he stood up, so suddenly his chair scraped hard against the hardwood floor, cutting through the noise of the party like broken glass. Conversations stopped one by one. Vanessa immediately turned toward him with a practiced smile that disappeared the moment she saw his face. "Daniel?" she asked quietly. He lowered the phone from his ear, but did not answer her right away. His hand trembled slightly. "I need a minute," he muttered before walking quickly toward his office. Vanessa followed him almost instantly, her heels striking sharply against the floor as she disappeared down the hallway behind him. The music continued playing softly overhead, but the atmosphere inside the dining room shifted completely. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone coughed awkwardly near the fireplace. Mia looked toward me with worried eyes. I gave her a small, reassuring smile, even though something heavy had already settled deep inside my chest. A few minutes later, raised voices drifted faintly from behind Daniel's office door upstairs. Not screaming. Worse, the kind of tense, frightened arguing people do when panic has finally broken through denial. I quietly folded my napkin and carried my untouched plate into the kitchen while the guests pretended not to notice anything unusual. The caterers had already started cleaning trays near the sink. Outside the windows, evening darkness had begun covering the neighborhood. Christmas lights blinked softly across neighboring houses while freezing rain tapped against the glass. Mia slipped quietly into the kitchen beside me while I rinsed dishes under warm water. "Grandma," she whispered carefully, "is Dad okay?" Children always know when adults are lying, even when they cannot understand the reasons yet. I dried my hands slowly with a towel before answering. "Your father is carrying a lot right now." Mia stared down at the floor. "Mom keeps buying things even when Dad gets upset about money." Her voice was small, honest. "Last week I heard them arguing about the house." I looked at her gently. At 12 years old, she already carried more awareness than either parent realized. "None of this is your responsibility," I said softly. Mia nodded, though she did not look convinced. Then she wrapped her arms around my waist unexpectedly and held on tighter than usual. "I do not like when people are mean to you," she whispered against my sweater. My throat tightened for the first time all day. I rested my hand lightly against her hair and closed my eyes for one brief moment. Upstairs, another door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps crossed the hallway. Then silence. Mia finally let go and returned slowly toward the living room where the remaining guests had started putting on coats and gathering purses. The party was ending early. Illusions are difficult to maintain once fear enters the room. About 20 minutes later, Daniel came. Downstairs alone. His face looked pale beneath the warm holiday lights. Vanessa did not follow him immediately. He walked directly into the kitchen and stopped beside the counter without speaking. For several seconds, he simply stared at the floor like a man trying to calculate how much of his life remained before collapse. "They moved the hearing up," he said quietly. "Monday at 9. I nodded once. "I see." He swallowed hard. "If I cannot stop it, we lose everything." The words seemed to physically hurt him as they left his mouth. Behind him, I noticed Vanessa standing silently near the hallway entrance. Her makeup still looked perfect. Her expensive dress still looked flawless. But fear had finally reached her eyes too. She crossed her arms tightly against herself. "Do not start acting hopeless," she snapped at Daniel, though her voice sounded thinner now. "There has to be another loan somewhere." Daniel laughed bitterly under his breath. "Another loan?" He turned toward her slowly. "Vanessa, we already owe nearly $500,000. Silence filled the kitchen instantly. Even the refrigerator humming in the corner suddenly sounded loud. Vanessa stared at him as if she had misheard the number. "What?" she whispered. Daniel dragged both hands across his face. "I tried to fix it before you found out." Vanessa stepped backward until her hand touched the edge of the counter for balance. "You told me the company was recovering." "I lied," he answered quietly. Nobody spoke after that. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while somewhere upstairs, one of the inflatable holiday decorations outside collapsed sideways in the wind. Sunday night arrived colder than the rest of the week. The temperature dropped below freezing after sunset, and a thin layer of frost covered the neighborhood lawns beneath the glow of Christmas decorations. Inside the house, almost nobody spoke during dinner. Vanessa barely touched her food. Daniel sat staring blankly at his plate while unpaid bills remained scattered across his office desk upstairs like quiet warnings waiting for morning. Mia stayed close to me all evening, sketching quietly beside the fireplace with the charcoal pencils I had given her. Around 8 o'clock, she handed me a drawing of a small white house with warm golden windows glowing against falling snow. "It looks safe," she said softly. I smiled at her and brushed my fingers gently across her hair. That matters more than people realize. Later that night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen with only the dim light above the stove turned on. The house creaked softly in the winter wind. Somewhere outside, an inflatable snowman motor hummed unevenly before going silent again. I opened the cedar chest I had carried with me through nearly every chapter of my adult life. Inside were old photographs, Arthur's watch, several faded letters tied together with ribbon, and beneath them all, a locked metal document case. I rested my hand on it for a long moment before opening it slowly. The papers inside represented 43 years of sacrifice. Investment records, ownership agreements, banking documents. Arthur had started a small supply company decades earlier before selling his shares shortly before he became ill. Most people believe the money disappeared into hospital bills and funeral costs after his death. I allowed them to believe that because grief teaches you quickly how differently people behave around money. Some become respectful. Others become entitled. Arthur understood this before I ever did. Protect it quietly, he told me during the final month of his life, while winter snow covered the hospital parking lot outside his window. One day Daniel may need saving from his own pride. I sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour reviewing the paperwork while the clock ticked softly on the wall. The numbers had grown steadily over the years because I lived carefully. No luxury vacations. No expensive jewelry. No need to impress strangers. Wealth hidden behind simplicity often survives longer than wealth displayed for attention. Around 10:30, I heard footsteps descending the staircase slowly. Daniel entered the kitchen looking exhausted. He had changed into sweatpants and an old sweatshirt from college, the same one he used to wear during late-night study sessions years ago. For a moment, he looked heartbreakingly young again. He stopped when he saw the documents spread across the table. "You are still awake?" he asked quietly. I closed the folder gently before answering. I could not sleep. Daniel leaned heavily against the counter. Neither could I. Silence settled between us comfortably for a few seconds. Then he spoke again, without looking directly at me. "Vanessa is terrified." I nodded slightly. "Fear changes people." He laughed bitterly under his breath. I barely recognized my own life anymore. His voice cracked slightly on the final word. I watched him carefully. Pride had finally collapsed beneath exhaustion. "Daniel," I said softly, "if everything disappeared tomorrow, what would matter most to you?" He frowned slightly, as though the question surprised him. Then he looked toward the staircase upstairs where Mia's bedroom sat at the end of the hallway. "My family," he answered immediately. I held his gaze for several seconds. "Good," I whispered. "Then there is still something left worth saving." Early Monday morning, freezing rain covered the roads in silver ice as Daniel prepared to leave for the foreclosure hearing downtown. Vanessa stood near the front door wrapped in an expensive cream-colored coat, but her face looked pale beneath her makeup. She kept checking her phone as though another miracle loan might suddenly appear overnight. Daniel picked up his briefcase slowly, then froze when he noticed me putting on my gloves beside the entryway. "Mom," he said quietly, confused. "Where are you going?" I buttoned my dark wool coat carefully before answering. "With you." Downtown Ashford looked almost colorless beneath the freezing rain that Monday morning. Traffic moved slowly through icy intersections while gray clouds pressed low over the city like something heavy waiting to break. Daniel drove in complete silence, both hands gripping the steering wheel tightly enough for his knuckles to pale against the leather. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat staring straight ahead, her expensive coat wrapped around her like armor that no longer worked. I sat quietly in the back seat beside my leather handbag, watching rain slide down the windows in thin silver lines. Nobody turned on the radio. Nobody spoke about hope anymore. By the time we reached the bank's legal office downtown, Daniel looked physically exhausted. The building itself was cold and modern, filled with polished marble floors and muted conversations drifting through narrow hallways. A Christmas tree stood near the reception desk, covered in white lights and silver ornaments, strangely cheerful against the tension hanging in the air. Daniel approached the front counter first, while Vanessa remained beside him, clutching her purse tightly against her side. I stood a few feet behind them, removing my gloves slowly, calmly, as though this were any ordinary appointment. The receptionist typed something into her computer before speaking carefully. "Mr. Harper, the hearing begins in 20 minutes. Daniel nodded weakly. Then another voice spoke from farther down the hallway. "Evelyn." Walter Green approached us carrying a black leather folder beneath his arm. The moment Vanessa saw him greet me directly, confusion flickered across her face. Daniel looked surprised too. "You know Mr. Green?" he asked quietly. Walter gave him a small, polite nod. "Your father and I worked together for many years." Vanessa frowned slightly. "Worked together where?" Walter glanced toward me briefly before answering. Arthur Harper was one of the founding partners of Green and Harper Industrial Supply. Silence followed immediately. Daniel stared at him. "What?" Walter remained calm. "Your father sold most of his shares before his illness, but not all of them." Vanessa slowly turned toward me, her expression tightening with confusion. "I do not understand," she said carefully. I held her gaze quietly without answering yet. Some truths arrived too suddenly for immediate explanation. Walter opened the folder in his hands and removed several documents along with a certified cashier's check. Even Daniel seemed unable to process what he was seeing. As of this morning, Walter continued professionally. All outstanding balances connected to the Harper residence, business liens, and commercial debt obligations have been satisfied in full. The hallway became completely silent around us. I could hear only the distant hum of fluorescent lighting overhead and the soft ticking of a wall clock near reception. Daniel blinked several times as though the words refused to settle properly in his mind. Satisfied, he repeated faintly. Walter handed him the paperwork carefully. Paid in full. Vanessa's face lost all color. That is not possible, she whispered. Her eyes moved slowly toward me. How? I finally stepped forward and rested one gloved hand lightly against the top of my handbag. Your father left more behind than people realized, I said quietly to Daniel. He looked down at the documents again, breathing unevenly. Mom, his voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. You did this. I nodded once. Vanessa stared at me with the same expression people wear when an entire version of reality suddenly collapses in front of them. But you. She stopped speaking halfway through the sentence because she finally understood how cruel her assumptions had been. I saved her from finishing it. Wore old sweaters? I asked softly. Drove an old car? Nobody answered. Walter closed the folder beneath his arm and stepped back respectfully. Daniel looked overwhelmed, ashamed, and grateful all at once. Vanessa, however, looked smaller than I had ever seen her before. Not because of money. Because for the first time since I met her, she realized she had completely misunderstood the quiet woman she spent years looking down on. I adjusted my gloves carefully and looked at both of them calmly. Being careful with money is not the same as being poor, I said gently. Then I turned toward Daniel. Your father worked too hard for this family to lose everything now. Daniel lowered his head suddenly and covered his eyes with one trembling hand. For several seconds, he could not speak at all. The drive home from downtown Ashford felt completely different from the drive there that morning. The freezing rain had stopped, and pale winter sunlight now reflected across the wet streets in long silver streaks. Daniel remained unusually quiet behind the wheel, both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as though he still could not fully believe the disaster hanging over his life had disappeared within a single hour. Vanessa barely spoke at all. She stared silently through the passenger window while expensive storefronts and decorated holiday displays passed outside in a blur. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain of how to behave around me. That uncertainty followed us all the way back to the house. Inside, the atmosphere had changed in ways too subtle for strangers to notice, but impossible for family to ignore. Daniel moved through the room slowly, almost carefully, like a man suddenly aware of how close he had come to losing everything he loved. Vanessa avoided meeting my eyes throughout the afternoon. Once or twice, I caught her watching me quietly from across the kitchen with an expression that looked painfully close to shame. By evening, snow had finally started falling outside. Soft flakes drifted down across the backyard, while warm yellow light glowed from the kitchen windows. Mia sat beside me at the table drawing another picture in her sketchbook while I prepared soup for dinner. Dad smiled today, she said softly without looking up from her drawing. He has not smiled in a while. I brushed my fingers gently across her shoulder. Sometimes people forget how heavy fear becomes until it is gone. A few minutes later, Vanessa entered the kitchen slowly. Her movements lacked the sharp confidence she usually carried. She stood near the counter twisting her wedding ring nervously around her finger before finally speaking. Evelyn, she said quietly, can we talk? Mia looked up immediately, sensing the tension. I smiled gently at her. Why do not you go show your father your drawing? Mia nodded and disappeared toward the living room, clutching her sketchbook against her chest. Once we were alone, silence settled heavily between us. Vanessa stared down at the marble countertop for several seconds before lifting her eyes toward me. I owe you an apology, she whispered. Her voice sounded fragile now. Honest. I judged you for years. I folded the kitchen towel slowly in my hands, but did not interrupt her. Tears gathered carefully in her eyes, although none fell, I thought. She stopped herself and shook her head slightly. No. The truth is, I assumed things about you because you did not live the way wealthy people usually live. I nodded once. Yes. Vanessa swallowed hard. And I treated you terribly because of it. The kitchen remained quiet except for the gentle simmer of soup on the stove behind us. Outside, snow continued covering the neighborhood in soft white silence. Finally, I looked directly at her. Being poor was never the shame, Vanessa, I said softly. Being cruel was. Her face crumpled slightly at those words. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal the weight of finally understanding them. I walked past her calmly and placed bowls onto the dining table one at a time. Money disappears faster than people think. I continued quietly. Character stays. Vanessa wiped quickly beneath her eyes and nodded without speaking. Over the next several months, many things changed inside that house. Daniel sold the oversized luxury SUV and downsized the business instead of trying to impress clients with appearances he could no longer afford. Vanessa stopped buying things simply to look successful. For the first time in years, she started cooking dinner herself instead of ordering catered meals during holidays. And slowly, awkwardly, she began treating me with something far more valuable than politeness. Respect. By spring, I moved into a small white cottage on the edge of Ashford with a wide front porch and rose bushes along the fence line. Daniel protested at first, but I reminded him gently that independence is not loneliness. It is peace. Mia visited every weekend carrying new drawings and stories from school, while Daniel helped me repair the old porch swing Arthur once loved. Sometimes Vanessa came too, quieter than before, carrying homemade pie or fresh flowers from the farmer's market. One warm evening nearly a year later, I sat on the porch watching golden sunset lights stretch across the neighborhood, while Mia rested beside me sketching birds in her notebook. The air smelled faintly of roses and fresh-cut grass. Somewhere down the street, children laughed while sprinklers clicked softly across nearby lawns. Mia suddenly looked up from her drawing. Grandma. Yes, sweetheart. Were you ever angry at Mom? I smiled gently and looked toward the fading sunlight beyond the trees. No, I answered softly. Just disappointed that she confused wealth with worth. Mia thought quietly about that for a moment before returning to her sketchbook. I leaned back against the porch swing and listened to the peaceful sounds of evening settling around the house. After a long life, I had finally learned something simple and permanent. The richest people are not the ones who spend the most money. They are the ones who still know how to protect kindness after the world gives them every reason not to.